Paramahansa Yogananda. You've probably heard the name. He's often seen as a spiritual giant. But, beyond all that massive influence, what are the serious critiques of his work? Well, today, we're going to dive into a critical look at his teachings, focusing on the core arguments from science, from logic, and even from theology. So, let's get right into it.
You really can't overstate Yogananda's impact. His book, Autobiography of a Yogi, was a total game changer. It brought concepts like Kriya Yoga and karma to a huge Western audience for the very first time. It really fundamentally shaped what a lot of us today think of as modern spirituality.
But, of course, that kind of popularity doesn't happen in a vacuum. It definitely didn't come without some serious scrutiny. In fact, critics have raised some big questions about the scientific, logical, and theological foundations of his whole philosophy. So what are they actually saying? Let's break it down.
Okay, so the first major line of criticism comes straight from a scientific point of view. And the big question they're asking is this: does Yogananda's main practice, Kriya Yoga, actually hold up to scientific standards? Or does it, fall into that tricky category of pseudoscience?
So, before we get into the weeds, let's just be super clear on what we mean when we say pseudoscience. It's not just something that's unscientific. No, it's a set of claims that kind of looks and sounds scientific on the surface, but it's missing the hard evidence and the rigorous testing that real science demands.
So, why do critics slap his label on Kriya Yoga? Well, they point to a few key things. First, there's a real lack of reproducible, peer-reviewed studies. Then there are these big claims that are basically impossible to prove false, like accelerating spiritual evolution. And a lot of the proof comes from personal stories, anecdotes, instead of objective, measurable data. Okay, let's get really specific with an example here. Yogananda made this very scientific-sounding claim that the breathing methods in Kriya Yoga could do way more than just help you relax. He said they could literally decarbonize the blood and transform plain old oxygen into a spiritual life force he called prana. Now, this is where the critique from biology gets really sharp. Scientists look at that and say, hold on a second. They argue that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of basic human physiology. Sure, breathing exercises affect our bodies, no doubt. But there is simply no known biological mechanism for turning an oxygen molecule into some kind of metaphysical energy. And this leads to what critics call a major logical problem. The philosophy basically says, hey, do this practice and you'll experience ultimate reality. So you try it and you feel something. Maybe you feel calm, maybe it's an altered state. And then that feeling is used as the proof that the entire philosophy is true. That, my friends, is a textbook example of circular reasoning. So, the second big area of criticism doesn't even look for outside evidence. Nope. Instead, it turns inward and focuses on potential contradictions within Yogananda's own system of thought. The question becomes, is the philosophy itself actually consistent? Okay, so here's the first big tension: universalism versus exclusivity. On one hand, Yogananda taught that all faiths are basically just different rivers flowing to the same ocean. All good, all valid. But then, on the other hand, he talked about Kriya Yoga as the airplane route, the faster, superior, most effective path. And this raises a big question from critics. How can all paths be equal if one is so clearly presented as being the best?
And you see a pretty similar contradiction when you look at karma versus divine grace. His teachings are built on this strict law of karma, this unyielding system where every cosmic debt has to be paid, no exceptions. But he also talked a lot about divine grace, where a higher power can just forgive you and wipe the whole slate clean. So which one is it? Is it all about a strict accounting of your deeds, or can you get a free pass that just bypasses all the rules?
All right, let's zoom out even further now. This final area of criticism looks at how Yogananda's philosophy really clashes with some of the core ideas of other major world religions. At the very heart of this worldview is the idea of karma. And according to the critiques, in this framework, suffering isn't just random or tragic. No, it's actually seen as a just and necessary punishment for bad things you did in a past life. So the cycle, as critics describe it, works something like this. You do bad things, and you rack up this karmic debt. Then you're reborn into a new life where you have to suffer in some way to pay off that debt. The entire purpose of that new life, of that suffering, is to balance the cosmic books, which hopefully gets you one step closer to breaking the cycle. And this leads to a really sharp social critique. Some sources argue that this whole philosophy of karmic debt was historically used to justify social hierarchies, like the caste system. It essentially frames a person's position in life not as a social or economic problem, but as a deserved and just consequence for what they did in the past.
And when you put this side by side with Abrahamic faiths like Christianity or Islam, wow, the differences are just stark. The idea of reincarnation to repay karmic debt is fundamentally at odds with the idea of one single life followed by a final judgment. Salvation through your own efforts clashes with the concept of divine grace and mercy, and an impersonal cosmic force is a world away from a personal creator God. We're not talking about minor disagreements here. These are deep foundational conflicts.
So the big takeaway here is that even though Yogananda often framed his teachings as being universally compatible, he even suggested Jesus was a yogi, critics argue the core beliefs are actually mutually exclusive. They say these aren't just different flavors of the same truth, but they're entirely different models for how reality itself is supposed to work.
So, we've walked through the scientific critiques, the logical ones, and the theological ones. And all of this leads us to a much, much bigger question for anyone who's exploring these kinds of ideas today. Just to recap, the critiques really fall into three main camps. You've got the scientific argument, that its claims are basically pseudoscience. Then there's the logical argument, that the philosophy contradicts itself. And finally, the theological argument, that it's just plain incompatible with other major faiths.
And this leaves us with one final, and I think really important question. When you're looking at a spiritual system that has clearly had a profound impact on millions, but it also faces these kinds of serious critiques, what do you do? For any belief system, really, how do we balance our own personal experiences and our faith with this kind of critical, logical analysis? It's a tough one, but it's definitely a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me.